the pagans, the hippies, everyone that, for whom Stonehenge is important, and tried to get some discourse going, some logic. We had a woman, Cluse Everard, who was a very intelligent manager of Stonehenge at that time. And as a result, we got the stones open to, recognised events, summer solstice. And the cordon that had blocked people from going there for 10 years after the Battle of the Beanfield was lifted. And thank God, it was a ridiculous thing. That Battle of the Beanfield should never have happened. And we set up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to investigate it and go into depth. Like, who ordered it? Why? Why did they beat up these hippies with their vans? They were just trying to live the midsummer dream of California in the English countryside, which is not easy, given the rain levels. But, and so that work was set up. George was the secretary, I was the chair, and that continues. We've had about 35 meetings in and around Stonehenge. And we're still trying to find out the records, the archives. We had an informal apology from the head of the police of Wiltshire at one meeting. A lot of it was filmed and recorded and minuted. And, it was agreed that it had been a mistake, a policing mistake, an overreaction, and it was part of the Thatcher era. She was bashing the miners, so she shipped in a bunch of really hardcore, heavies, who had no uniform identification badges on and so on, who just truncheoned these long-haired hippie types who just wanted to go and get stoned in a field and watch the sun come up. So it was a clash, a paradigm clash, if you want, between the Summer of Love types and the establishment led by Thatcher, who were veering towards authoritarian fascism. Thatcher was a fan of Pinochet smashing the left, smashing the miners, and the trade unions and so on. And she was for big, strong, quasi-fascist authoritarian, clamp down on freedom of thought. So that's what that paradigm clash was about. And that's why it's interesting to me as a peace intellectual to have taken on that case, which I did and I still do, and I published a book about it. And the conflict is still not over. Stonehenge is still not free to access. It's still not available for peace-loving druids and shamans and so on who want to go and do a few ceremonies, light some candles, say some prayers to the old gods. You can't do that still. I think you should be able to. I think there should be access, like in Salisbury Cathedral for Christians. You don't have to pay a tourist fee. You go in and say a few prayers, and it's a sacred site. Well, the pagan community that I've met and worked with, it's a sacred site, and we should be able to go and do ceremonies and so on. My solution is to have a spiritual pilgrimage centre somewhere near Stonehenge, which would be run and administered by the pagan and spiritual community for themselves, on land given by the MOD for a peppercorn rent for 999 years, for 99p a year. And that would be some small acknowledgement of the debt that the country owes to its pagan heritage, really, and its druidical heritage, and the people that built Stonehenge thousands of years ago. And I know that English heritage always try and say, no evidence the Druids had anything to do with Stonehenge. That's a complete lie and a complete, it's misinformation. It's as stupid as saying that 9/11 was caused by the Al-Qaeda 19 when all the evidence points oppositely. So anyway, inspired by that, and I was working with the Druid Council of Britain. I was the peace officer of the Druid Council of Britain by now. I was sitting on the Anglican Pacifist Fellowship at the same time, and doing a lot of interfaith work. I became the World's Conference on Religion and Peace Secretary General in the 90s at this time, which took me to Rome. It took me to a huge conference of faith leaders from all over the planet when Pope John Paul II was still alive, who was chairing the meeting, and I met great thinkers and theologians and from all religions. My job was to bring peace between them all in some way, and that gave me the insight to set up a thing called the Multi-Faith Multicultural Mediation Service, which I set up in '95. We had a training in Oxford, and representatives from each faith came, and it was a marvellous event. I designed the training manual, And it's still going, and it's still the only interfaith peacemaking mediation service that's active in the world. You know, if you're having a fight with your Sikh neighbour and you're a Hindu and you don't want to kill each other, you can contact this mediation service. Or if it's a Jewish versus Christian or Islamic or whatever. And as part of that work, I realised that really taking that model, the Truth and Reconciliation model, forward would be a good idea to do with Ireland and Britain, because although we had the Good Friday Agreement in place, we didn't really have peace. We didn't have a solution long term to the unease and disquiet that many people felt, and there was still a sense of pain at the conflict. So I set up, with help from colleagues, under the aegis of the Institute, which was from the University of London, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for Britain and Ireland, or the TRCBI, which has met several times, and it's it's given me insight and compassion to these stories on all sides of those times of troubles. I've chaired meetings in Dublin, in Belfast, also in Wales, in Holyhead, which is the closest port to Ireland. And I've listened to people who've been involved in those conflicts. We heard from a person who had worked, he was involved with the IRA, and it had been a very disturbing experience for him. He was brought up on an estate in Belfast as a Roman Catholic boy, friends with everybody, going to the same schools, no problem. In his teens one day, when the troubles were just starting, I guess it was the late 60s, suddenly he looked out the window and his mum was there, and they saw like a mob appearing with all kinds of stuff in their hands, like bats and whatever. And they knocked on the door and said, "You better clear out of the house in the next 20 minutes, we're going to burn it down." And he and his mum said, what are you talking about? I recognise you, you're Jimmy, we played football together. They said, "No, sorry, the time's over, we're taking this over, it's a Protestant area." And they had to leave the house with the few belongings they could take. This was recorded, it's on the video that my partner Nicola Haig made about this. She filmed it as I was chairing it. And it's on our website, you can watch it in detail. But the long and the short of it is he didn't know who to turn to for support and help. So he was drawn to the IRA. It was the only body that was standing up to defend the rights of people that were being attacked and targeted like this. And he then worked for the IRA in various official capacities. I don't know the full details. He didn't obviously say, but they regarded it as a military organisation that was fighting for the independence and unity of Ireland, and they had codes of practice and so on. And their enemy was the British state. Eventually, he was captured and ended up in prison. And was part of the protests, the hunger strikes, and so on. And he was liberated only after the Good Friday Agreement, which was the deal which made it possible for these prisoners to be released. They'd been demanding their rights as political prisoners during this whole time, and that was being denied by the British government, which led the prisoners to then strip off and refuse food and it must have been horrendous and talk about paradigm clash. The Stonehenge thing is a paradigm clash. Well, this is a mega paradigm clash between people who regard themselves as freedom fighters for Irish civilization and culture versus instruments of the British state that think of themselves as rational and good and reasonable, and just these people are terrorists. So this is a huge paradigm clash. And I listened and filmed the testimony from him and others like him. And also from the other side, we heard from Protestants, we heard from loyalists, who had lived through the same experiences but seen them from a totally different upside-down lens. For them, the IRA were the terrorists. Now, my job is to stay neutral on this, and I'm not going to support, ultimately, the mono-truth notion. As a philosopher, I believe in a plurality of parallel truths. They meet at infinity. They meet when we finally encounter the absolute truth of the Supreme Lord, Ram or Buddha or whatever you want to call Christ. Each one of us, as we toil along through our mortal life, we have to follow the truth we can, the Dharma that's given to us. I insist on peace as the means as well as the goal. Like Gandhi, I say non-violence has to be the path. So I would not have supported or agreed with violent actions by the IRA or the Protestant loyalists. And I never have in my life. I've never killed anyone or injured anyone consciously. Apart from, in school playground fights when you're like 8, maybe. Apologies for that. But that was just self-defense. So how do we get the common narratives to emerge from that plural discourse? That's what my thesis was about, because don't forget, all this time I'm writing up a doctoral thesis, and I came up with this notion that the only way we can do that is what I call transpersonal history, which was a new kind of Jungian-inspired, Saggioli, Wilbur-esque transpersonal idea that history has to be big enough to have room for all the narratives. In the book of Enoch, when Enoch goes to the throne of God, there's this tremendous screen in front of God, and Enoch is the scribe reading it, which tells the story of everything that's ever happened on the planet, all the karmic interactions of every single soul and incarnation, in any time, any place, anywhere on this planet. And Enoch's watching this with stupendousness, like, gosh. Well, I think there's got to be something like that. I love the books of Enoch, which is why I did a commentary on them, because they're an attempt by early mystics operating within the Judaic mystical tradition, which later was called the Kabbalah, to try and figure out what is karma and how's it operating here on this planet. And I think there is such a thing. And the only way we can heal the karmic conflicts is by rising to a higher plane, all of us as much as possible, through our own spiritual practice, our meditation, our study, our interactions with people, and basically getting to a place of love. You see, if you get to a place of love, like Christ had done, think of living at the time of Christ. Terrible conflict, paradigm clashes going on all over the place. The main one, the Jewish versus the Roman, but the Hellenistic versus the ancient Semitic, the Zoroastrian tinged Judaism that had come back. The whole thing was a muddle, and everybody wanted to kill everyone else, or sleep with them, or both, usually. The Romans tended to have very complicated sex lives where they'd end up killing each other. Against all that, Jesus somehow tried to forge a path of love, non-violence, and non-judgmentalism. When he said, do not judge, lest ye be judged, I think what he was saying is try and elevate your mind's perception of things to a higher plane so that you don't immediately see the person in front of you as the enemy. If you go around thinking he's the enemy, I hate him, I hate her, you're going to have a miserable life. What he was saying is elevate yourself to a place where you see the divine in everyone, and you'll begin to reach for that universal truth that was the message. He calls that the kingdom of God, and in my commentaries on the Gospels I've gone into detail trying to explain what I think he meant by that. If you apply that transpersonal historical approach to the troubles of Ireland, there is hope. We can grow out of them. I call myself, a Protestant Catholic. I'm an Anglican Protestant, Quaker for many years. I love some aspects of that heritage, but I'm also Catholic in that I search for the universal wisdom path, and I want ultimate truth, and I love the Vatican Library, and if anyone ever harms the Vatican, I will join the Swiss Guards. I love the Catholic heritage, and I love the music and the arts and the churches, and the cultural history of Catholic Europe is a rich and priceless heritage. You just go to cathedrals like Auxerre near me here in France, and it's to die for, beautiful. But the Protestant side of me is also strong and wants to be critical, and rational scholarship, and supports the Cathars and is always on the side of the heretics. So, how can I be both? Well, only because I've touched a transpersonal insight place deep within me. I've been to a place where those labels don't matter; they're not significant. I've been to the place Rumi talks about, where he says, there's a field beyond good and evil. I'll meet you there. It's when we go to that place of enlightenment that these conflicts can fall away, and that's why I set up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for Britain and Ireland. We can't get reconciliation without that truth, and that's the depth of the truth I'm talking about. So anyway, fast forward. I've been hopeful about Ireland during this last few years, and I've learned more, as I always do, about Irish history and culture, and the more I learn, the more I find to appreciate. And then suddenly Brexit, right? I mean, out of nowhere, like a storm in Argyll, where I was living at the time, in Scotland, in a castle, very conscious of the links to Ireland. Argyll was settled by the Gaels, the Irish. Scotland and Ireland are very close culturally. And I thought about it in great detail, and I decided to vote for Remain. I decided on many, many, many grounds. I worked it out rationally as a philosopher. I didn't campaign, I probably should have done, but I thought about it as an intellectual, and then I decided quite strongly to vote for Remain. And I was disappointed when the result was so narrow and it showed up, in favour of exit. I felt personal guilt because I'd posted my own ballot vote in an envelope, and it was returned to me unrecorded. Now, I'm still, to this day, I still have the thing, I mean, in other words, my vote was never counted in the voting. I don't want to get all conspiratorial and say it was returned to me deliberately, but that's what it looked like. I mean, it was extraordinary. I've never had that happen before. And it was returned because apparently, the panel that shows had my address on it. Well, there's no way in a million years I would post it with the wrong address showing. I'm not that stupid. So all I can say is it looked like somebody had tinkered, opened the envelope, and then returned it to me. Well, I wonder how many other people had that experience. If you know of someone that happened to, and there's 20,000 of us, then that would be very interesting, because it means there was a deliberate interference and tampering with that referendum. The other thing I've heard is that many people who were living in Europe, Britons, in France and Germany and so on, who applied for postal ballots never received them in time. And again, there were thousands of people who were excluded from voting as a result. The other thing that I find very extraordinary about that referendum is that no limit was set. Looking back, what, were we all asleep? I mean, no referendum that alters so fundamentally the political constitutional arrangements of the country should be allowed to pass by one vote, Because obviously 50-50, countries split, you shouldn't change it. And that's every country that ever has referendums, that's the law. And they always bring in something like a 10 or a 20% margin of victory for it to be effective. It's the same in America. They have referendums quite often, but it has to be a substantial majority. That wasn't brought in, and I find that, with hindsight, absolutely incredible and suspicious. Why would something this important have been put to the public without those safeguards in place, And I can only think that the reason is fear. I think David Cameron lost his nerve at a certain point during his premiership, and it's unfortunate for the nation. I respected what he tried to do for Britain. I thought he was a moderate conservative with a conscience. He was in alliance with the Liberal Democrats, Nick Clegg and the Liberal Democrats, who were the conscience of that coalition, if you want. And I thought they got the country out of a bit of a mess. Economically, it had been in difficulties and so on. They did, I think, a good job on the whole. And then, unfortunately, the Liberals lost their coalition role, and David Cameron was forced to deliver this referendum. He's now said he never thought he'd have to. He thought the Liberal Democrats were going to be in coalition and he wouldn't be able to do it. The problem is the Tory press, the Mail, the Telegraph and the right-wing papers was so anti-liberal, and still are, that they'd done such a hatchet job against Nick Clegg, who strikes me as a very moderate and intelligent man, now working with Facebook, which is probably a very good job for him. That extremist right-wing press hate liberalism and its core, because they realise that the real intellectual challenge to Toryism is actually authentic liberalism, which is premised on freedom as opposed to kind of effectively slavery. What the Tory party have done is created a nation of debtors enslaved to the capitalist system, who are always working so hard they don't have time for anything outside the box. So everybody's in fear of their job, their salary, their next paycheck. Everyone's a couple of paychecks away from destitution, unless you're a rich Tory with money offshore in the Isle of Man, or bound up in property, or whatever. I mean, the scandal of multiple landlords able to own hundreds of homes in Britain, and other people are homeless on the streets. I mean, these are things that a Liberal government or a Liberal stroke Labour coalition should and could amend. I mean, I've been reading, as some of you know, the Das Kapital, just as an intellectual exercise, a debt I owe my mother. And the conditions of Britain in the 1840s, 1850s and 1860s that he describes in great detail, drawing on parliamentary reports of the working class, of the poor, and their hopeless living conditions. Engels had written about them, the working class in England as well. And Marx is always quoting from his friend and colleague. These were shocking times, and the point of why he wrote Das Kapital was to show, well, what's causing this? And really it's greed, it's human greed. It's capitalists, people that own a lot of money, wanting to secure that money in places where it can't be got at by the very people that help create that wealth, to put it in a nutshell. It's also interesting that Marx was extremely conscious of the Irish problems, and he was aware of the famine, he was aware of what had been done to Ireland by the English capitalist landlords. And Engels had an Irish girlfriend in Manchester, and through her learned a lot about what life was like for the Irish underclass in England and back in Ireland. And it's also interesting that Marx was quite interested in the Jacobite tradition, it turns out. I've been doing a lot of work on this. And he quotes from a Jacobite economist who was the first chap to use the word political economy. And Marx's Das Kapital is a critique of political economy, inspired by this Jacobite economist, who was a great thinker, actually. And I think Marx was aware of that the old cause of the Scots had been destroyed in order to pave the way for modern capitalism. Because it was William and the Wilhelmite, so-called Glorious Revolution that brought in the Bank of England and established the modern capitalist system in England that we have. The Stuarts had a much more different feudal, spiritual, monarchical understanding of the duty of kings to people. And it certainly wasn't to impoverish them and to reduce them to like proletarians living in slums just to improve capital. In the Stuart system, which was destroyed willfully by the English state, there's no care, there's no compassion for people as people. It's simply what you earn and can accumulate for my profit. That's Marx's thesis in a nutshell, and there's huge detail in there which I'm listening to. But so he was very aware of Ireland and its problems. Now fast forward, so that's why I think the Irish, when they finally came to say, look, we've had enough of this English stuff, we want a revolution in 1916, a lot of them had read Marx. They'd been inspired by this guy because he was a serious fighter for social justice, and he knew what they'd been through as a nation. The famine was scandalous, and the kind of the neglect the patrician neglect by the English of people dying en masse on your streets, in just across the water, and saying, well, nothing we can do. It's like it's just unfortunate, isn't it? That is that cold English arrogance which came from being the world's great mercantilist centre, capitalist trading centre, the Bank of England, and so on. And then to run a system like that, you have to deaden your conscience. To sit in an office and sign a paper that is going to kill 10,000 people through starvation, you have to have ethically deadened yourself. And that, I think, is what the English education system is essentially designed to do. That's why I had such a hard time teaching ethics. And I think that's wrong. Obviously I'm going to say that as a philosopher, a moral philosopher, trained by Scottish Kantians at the University of Bristol. I'm going to say that that's wrong, and a country will not survive long if we go down the unethical route. I mean, Gandhi also, as a great Dharma holder, truth seeker, he took on the British Empire and he defeated it ultimately with the the help of the whole spiritual resistance movement that he got going. Now, a lot of Gandhi's work inspired Irish revolutionaries. Some took the pacifist line and said, we can defeat the British through art and poetry. That was Yeats's kind of view, and the Abbey Theatre and so on, and A.E. and these other great mystics. They loved theosophy, the Irish, because they resonated with its revival of the ancient Celtic mystery traditions. Blavatsky loved the Druids as well. She talks about them, but others said, no, you can't fool about here. This is a military empire. We have to have a rising, guys. And the 1916 revolution was extraordinary. It was mostly poets and teachers and intellectuals. They could hardly shoot a rifle, and they symbolically seized the post office in the centre of Dublin, a few other buildings. They knew they would be smashed. It was a symbolic thing. It was a pageantry saying, wake up, people. Maud Gonne, who was Yeats's muse, supported that. Sean McBride, her son, was a descendant of her husband, who'd been a captain in the Irish Revolutionary Army and so on. So these were heroic, romantic revolutionaries, and their history deserves to be taught in English schools. We need to respect and learn about this stuff if we're going to move to a future as a country together in Britain and Ireland. So, of course, history moved on, and I think the fundamental point I'm saying here is that if Brexit's to be stopped, it has to be a concerted effort by the people of Northern Ireland, Wales, England, Scotland, coming together and saying, you know what, we've looked at it, we don't actually want this. We'd rather keep our country together and stay in the EU. And I think once we achieve that, then I think there must be much better education in British schools to realise this nightmare we've just escaped from. The solutions to Brexit, I've worked out there are only like 4 or 5 options, but if there's going to be a second referendum, and I think there must be, it's the only way out, the ballot paper should read as follows, right? Either the UK remains together inside the European Union. Now that's option A, that's the one I would vote for, because in spite of everything, I think it's a much better solution. We stay together. And we stay inside the European Union, we contribute from our intellectual, economic and cultural resources to the betterment of Europe as a whole. Europe isn't perfect, it has problems. Look at the tensions between Italy and what's going on in France and so on. It has normal politics, right, left, juggling for position and so on. But I think the British liberal middle way type mentality can help that. If only we get our act together and save our country from self-destruction. The only other option, actually, is that England and Wales leave the EU independently, and Scotland and Ireland remain separated from the UK and stay in the EU. I mean, Scotland has demonstrated that it wishes to remain in the EU, and I believe it feels that so strongly that if Brexit is called and pushed down their throats, they will have a second independence referendum. Independence will win, and they will rejoin the EU after yet another referendum. So that's the only option, really, is England and Wales leave separately, Scotland would stay in the EU or rejoin it, and Northern Ireland also would do the same. I think, as Sinn Féin have said, they will demand immediately on Brexit a independence referendum whereby Northern Ireland joins the South. That's guaranteed under the Good Friday Agreement, that such a referendum should be put to the Irish people. Now, ministers in the Irish government, in the Northern Ireland office, are saying, we can't get out of this commitment. We signed the Good Friday Agreement. They have to grant such a referendum. And I believe it would be almost certainly won by the Let's Make One United Ireland lobby. And so that's the cost of Brexit. So the Cameron, because of his naivety, I mean, the man wasn't, with all due respect, really a political thinker. He was a man that used to work for Carlton Television. He's a PR guy. And my partner at the time worked for Carlton Television, you know, in the 80s. It's not actually political depth that he's coming from. He pulled the referendum as a kind of stunt based on fear, without thinking through the consequences. And my daughter studied English for a time at Eton with the guy that taught him, and said, no, Cameron was not very clever. I'm sorry to have to give all these secrets away, but you know, we need to know this. The guy was nice, no doubt very affable, you know, but didn't have the kind of depth of thinking of a Burke, say, if you're going to look at the Conservative tradition, or, you know, a Keir Hardie or someone. Didn't have the real depth of thinking that differentiates between a politician and a statesman. And his silly idea, his silliness, has led to this crisis we're in. And I'm very disappointed. No wonder he's hiding out in his hut in Oxford. So the option from this mess, how do we solve this? Well, there's really only two choices. It's going to be England and Wales leave, and Scotland and Ireland remain in the EU. And that's going to happen in a year or two. Now, and that really is the choice that should be on a ballot paper. Of those choices, I mean, I personally actually think that even Wales will get its act together. If that happened, let's just imagine, do a historical forward, projection. If Brexit happens, England and Wales leave, and the economy crashes, as it would, bickering, the only people that can afford anything are security guards and police and lawyers and corrupt politicians. And normal people are kind of like just, you know, one hour away from the bailiffs, which is where most of them are at the moment. I don't think Wales will stay in that union for long. I think they'll rejoin the rest of civilised Europe and maybe even craft a new kind of Celtic nation, you know, an internation. I'm sure they'll be having their trade deals and so on. As part of European community, Wales is a European country. I lived there for 10 years. Its roots are in Europe. Its intellectuals, its druids, its philosophers are pan-European. They have closer ties to Brittany than they do to, you know, Walsall or whatever. And so, yeah, I can foresee that eventually England alone will be outside the EU and a rather miserable and upset place, and probably going through its own little revolutionary upheavals finally. I mean, I don't think it's going to be a pleasant place to be, and you'll have your sort of extreme